Joshua chapter 23. So we're back tonight studying the book of Joshua. Last week, Chris went over chapter 11, and then he gave a pretty good summary, a lot better than I'm about to give a summary of chapters 12 through 22. So just going over this real quick, I don't know where he found those maps, but they were amazing. I did the best I could, so don't laugh. All right. Chapter 12, we have the summary of the conquest. So this included the kingdoms that Moses captured on the east side of the Jordan, and then it included the kingdoms that Joshua conquered west of the Jordan. Chapter 13 lists all the unconquered land yet to take. Then the land east of the Jordan is allotted to Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Land distribution begins for the tribes in chapter 14, including Joshua, Caleb, and the Levites. Judah's allotment is in chapter 15, with more description of Caleb's land, with him driving out the giants and giving land to his daughter and to Othniel, who will be the first judge. He was given Hebron, also known as Kiriath Arba. Interesting about that name is that Arba, the last part of Hebron's former name, was the father of Anak, who is the father of the giants. Just like at the Oak of Shechem, where Abraham came into the land and stopped there to build an altar, I guess Abram liked oaks so much, so he went over to Hebron, to the Oaks of Mamre, and he lived there. And a lot of the story of Abraham is in this city. Here he rescues Lot from being captured. He sends his small army. He had his name changed to Abraham, and he was also promised a son here. Also, Sarah died at this place, and he bought the cave of Machpelah to bury her there. Isaac and Jacob also spent their lives here. In this cave of Machpelah, it happens that all the patriarchs and their wives were buried here, except for Rachel. Hebron is also where David later was anointed king, and he ruled here until Jerusalem was captured. Chapters 16 and 17, we have Ephraim and Manasseh's allotment. In chapter 17, we also see the mention of the daughters of Zelophehad. If you don't know that story, it's a group of daughters whose father died, who had no sons. And they asked Moses and then later Joshua what they were going to do because they didn't have a man to inherit their allotted land. And so they consulted God, and God told them, they're all right, they need some land. So they had it to where they could marry within their own tribe, and they gained the land back. So this promise was fulfilled back was stated first in Numbers 27:7, and is now fulfilled in chapter 17. Then we have chapter 18. We see how they throw lots for all the tribes, and the first one is for Benjamin. And then in chapter 19, we see the rest of the allotments for the land for all the other tribes except for Levi. Now it turns out, hold on a second. I forgot I planted it on both sides of the pages, which is dangerous for a speaker. Chapter 19, we see the mention of Dan will eventually conquer a city way up north and settle in that part of the land. They will name the town after their namesake, Dan. And this is a repeat of the story found also in Judges chapter 18. In chapter 20, we have the cities of refuge listed for the Levites, which can also be found in Numbers chapter 35. So kind of a fulfillment there. In chapter 21, we have the list of cities with its pasture lands allotted for the Levites with priestly duties. And then in chapter 22, we have the tribes finally settling down, and then the altar of witness set by the eastern tribes, and then the whole misunderstanding there. If we look at the last 3 chapters of Joshua, we can actually see a pattern here. We see 3 different aspects of influence that may cause problems, including sin. And this can be said in our own lives. We can make an application of this. In our lives, sometimes we have to defend against the sinful influences of our own family and friends, but also the sinful influences from the outside world, the culture around us, or multiple cultures, and against also the internal struggle within each of us. So, defending against the sinfulness of both friend and foe, as well as both external and internal influences. Chapter 22 is about tribal unity and is a reminder of the sin-corrupting threat for the Israelite tribes internally from other tribes and from their own relatives. There's also a sibling rivalry going on between the tribes, and sibling rivalry has existed since the first 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. It will not take long into Judges that we see tribal warfare. And in fact, Benjamin is almost completely destroyed because of it. In an ideal world, all the tribes would be unified in following God. And the end of chapter 22 of Joshua deals with this, when the western tribes come to fight the eastern tribes due to the perceived disloyalty in this altar of witness that the eastern tribes had set up. It's a complete misunderstanding, but everything turns out fine between the tribes at the end. And we know looking forward that this altar did not last as a memorial. It wasn't too long before those tribes on the eastern side of the Jordan were corrupted. So what the western tribes were doing, they were obeying God, because the law states that you have to purge the evil from among you to avoid the internal corruption. And it appears the western tribes were willing to go there and to wipe out 3 whole tribes, or 2.5. In chapter 23, we have questions of gratitude and loyalty, as well as obedience and integrity to God. And there is a reminder of the threat externally from the nations and cultures all around them, who, in fact, they did not destroy. Some they even made a covenant with, like the Gibeonites. And this is the rivalry between cultures and different religions. So we will see in Judges how the nations around them, including the ones they conquered, will start to influence them to sin. They will start following the gods of the nations around them. But the solution is to avoid intermarrying with them and to shun and purge the evil among them. Looking ahead to Judges, so far we're 2 for 2 on the failure front for Israel. Chapter 24 doesn't get any better in the book of Judges, is about following statutes and rules set up by God, and is a reminder of the threat within themselves. Joshua says that they are a stubborn people and they will not obey God because of it. Very appropriate. Both of Sean's lessons on Sunday applied to my lesson tonight, so that was great timing. Sean's Sunday morning lesson, he expounded on the rivalry between flesh and spirit. And Paul writes about this, of course, in Romans chapter 7, about this war internally between the spirit and the flesh. He says that, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want to do is what I keep doing." So this chapter 24 in Joshua foreshadows the corruption of the Israelites. The solution is to teach future generations of the law and to have gratitude for what God has done for them. That's always the answer. And as we see in Judges, this corruption happens with guys like characters like Samson or the Levite and Micah at the end of Judges, and then what goes on in the town of one of the towns of Benjamin. Some really R-rated stuff. So that's the overarching look at the focuses of these 3 chapters. So we won't get into chapter 24 tonight, but we will dive into chapter 23. So at the end of Joshua, we see many promises begin to be fulfilled. In verse 14 of chapter 23, we are told, "Not one word has failed of all the good things the Lord promised." And here's a couple within the book of Joshua, as well as those in Deuteronomy chapter 4, made with Moses. And then we see in Deuteronomy 4, verse 38, a mention of driving out the nations. This is confirmed in chapter 23, verse 9 of Joshua. We also see the promise made in Joshua chapter 1, verse 5, that no man will stand against Joshua and that God will not leave him. Joshua confirms both in verse 3 of chapter 23 and in verse 9, this one verse in chapter 1. So in verse 3, Joshua tells the people that God has fought for you. And, when Joshua is telling the Israelites that God's doing something, he's included in that. So God has fought for them. God was there the whole time. In verse 9, it confirms that no man was able to stand against Israel, which includes Joshua. So these 2 verses confirms the fulfillment of these 2 prophecies or promises made to Joshua. And then Moses and Deuteronomy. We also have very similar language in these 3 chapters. All 3 include the message to keep all the commandments of the Lord. In Joshua, it references back to the one Moses wrote down, calling it there on the top right. He refers back to the law of Moses. We have similar structure to the warnings contained in both Deuteronomy 4 and Joshua 23. One from Moses and the other from Joshua, both to the Israelites. So many Israelites would have heard both speeches. That's kind of fun to think about. Many Israelites would have heard both speeches. They both mentioned there in green, not to forget or turn back because God will consume you. It's the red lettering. Highlighted yellow, you see the warning to stay away from the carved images and all the gods of the nations around you. Then below in these 2 chapters, same 2 chapters, you have both Moses and Joshua go on to say that they will perish if they transgress, provoking God to anger. Now in chapter 23, we see Joshua's farewell address. Now, farewell addresses in the Bible mark a pretty significant end to an era. These addresses always are significant in the Bible. Something major is ending and something major is beginning. Joshua marks the end of the journey to obtain the promised land. He marks the end to the fulfillment of those promises. And then you also have folks like Jacob and Moses and Samuel and David and Jesus. All their final speeches mark pretty significant eras in the Bible. The structure of chapter 23 is extremely simple. You have the first 1.5 verses as the narrative, and the rest of the chapter is Joshua speaking in his farewell address. Something to keep an eye out on. So there's only 16 verses in this chapter, but you will notice phrases like nations that remain, these nations, instead of saying, remember those nations. The nations are all still around. So I will highlight them green as we go. So these phrases begs the question of, what happened? Weren't they supposed to conquer all these nations? What happened on God's part? Well, some things that we can gather is that God did give them the land and its people into Israel's hands. It was there for the taking. It was up to them to do so. The Israelites did take many parts of the land and destroyed many of the people, but they failed to take 100% of the land or to destroy 100% of the people due to the lack of trust in God. But God assures them, though they failed, He would still help them continue to drive out the inhabitants as long as they continued to be faithful. So God, if you notice in the Bible, God's constantly making alterations to accommodate the failures of humans. All right, let's start reading. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel's, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years. So in one verse, in verse 1, it is mentioned that Joshua is old and well advanced in years. And we see other significant figures in the Bible also announce that they are old, like Isaac and Samuel and Moses and Naomi. All pretty good characters, I would say. Also in verse 1, we see this mention of rest there at the top. This is also confirmed in Joshua 21, where it says that the Lord gave them rest on every side, as He had sworn to their fathers. So this same word, nuach, is used to describe Noah's Ark when it rested on the mountains. And it's the same word that described the priest's feet as they carried the ark and they rested in the Jordan and the flood waters separated or pushed back, rolled back. So it's not necessarily rest as like sleep, but it's more of a rest of settling. And so God's promise is fulfilled here. So in Joshua chapter 1, the Lord told them that God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. And that was the word of Moses. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and then Deuteronomy chapter 24, both mention God giving them rest from their enemies in the future as well. So another promise fulfilled. All right, continuing in verse 3. So you see the highlighted things I said to keep an eye out for. So verse 3. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. So in verse 6, it says it reminds them to be strong. And I often feel like this is an overstated phrase in the Bible. But then I'm reminded of the actions of the people show how not strong they are. And so maybe it's not overstated. In the book of Judges, we definitely see that they are not strong. In verse 7, it mentions that they were not to mention or speak of the evil, any of the names of the gods of these people that they had destroyed, and those of the nations still living around them. And if you think about it, if they had purged all the references to these gods and then did not talk about them, it would not take a generation or two to just completely forget about them. They would be lost forever. But that did not happen, as we can see later in the Old Testament. And if it did at all, it was definitely not enough. So God is telling them to don't mix in. Don't mention their gods or serve or bow down to them. So instead, verse 8, it says to cling. That got off. Shifted a couple words that way or that way. So it's supposed to be on cling. So this is what happens whenever you open it up on a new computer. Anyways, in verse 8, the word cling to the Lord your God, used elsewhere in the Bible as to cling to a wife or cling to take hold of in an attack. So in other words, be really close to God. Pull yourself up to God or perish. And we all must be close to God under his protection to survive. Let's read verse 9 through 11. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. So in verse 11, in this context, the term love, a little over, is more of a political term. This means like loyalty to a king, to keep the king's decrees. Notice how the Lord in the previous verses act like a king, where he says he fights for you, he drives out the nations for you. So he's acting kind of like a king. Then in verse 12, it reads, for if you turn back and cling, there's that word again, meaning that don't draw too closely to these nations. To the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you. Know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you. So, if you get too close, they will be a snare for you. It's kind of like a mouse gets too close to a trap or a bird. Back up in verse 12, Joshua tells them, if you join yourself to these other people, like marrying them, then God will not help you drive them out anymore. And it has nothing to do with their intrinsic features, things like that they were born with. You know, it's not because they were short or tall or balding or had different skin color or curly or straight hair. This principle behind this is don't associate with them, because they will sinfully influence you to worship their gods or other gods. And this is consistent even within their own people, their own tribes. They are to stomp out all the evil, even a spouse or a brother or relative, a son or daughter, or even a whole town, to purge the evil. And no one should be marrying them either, or be joined with them. They also should have already purged the outsider, but failed. And again, God is having to set up rules around their failures and the sinfulness of man. Verse 14. And now I am about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish. And you shall perish quickly from off the good land that he has given you to you. So, in verses 14 and 15, I read it like, remember how great God is fulfilling all these promises, that all these prophecies? Well, remember the prophecy of what he promised to do to you if you turn against him? Well, he's pretty good at fulfilling promises, so you better get in line. In verse 16, if you transgress, that's an interesting word. I won't try to pronounce it, but this term is actually harsher than translated. We see a second term, perish, which is from the Hebrew word avad, which means to wander aimlessly. So these two words are very interesting in the context of the people of Israel. So if you've been paying attention to what's been going on, I think you'll recognize from the definitions what these might apply to. So the first word contains the root word to cross, or abar. Here in verse 16, we have a version of the word that's translated transgress. So as you can see, it's a popular word. I went and found all the times that this word was used. And you can see it's a pretty popular word in the book of Joshua. 57 times. So Joshua is telling them, remember all that crossing that you guys did over and over and over? Well, if you transgress or cross back over my covenant with you, then I'm going to make you cross back over as well. If you cross my covenant, if you cross back over, then I'm going to make you cross back over as well. And then the second word is abad. And it usually is used to mean perish. We can see this used in Deuteronomy 26:5 when it refers to Abraham as a wandering Aramean. So this is the same word. I think knowing the story ahead for the Israelites, we could probably fit both meanings of this word, to perish and to wander, into the story of the Israelites. Many will perish due to their disobedience, but eventually God kicks them out of the land, causing them to wander again. And God warned them, prophesied what would happen, and it did. And we will see this later as God caused death due to disobedience just in the next book of Judges, and in the times of Kings, and then after that. Eventually, the Assyrians take most of the tribes away, and then the Babylonians come for Judah. So I wanted to know, I was curious while studying this, how long did it take for God's promises to be fulfilled? Not necessarily how long it took God, but just how long did time pass between when his promise was made and it was fulfilled? Well, it's about 485 years. And we know that because in Galatians 3:17, we are told that the timeline from Abraham to when the law of Moses was given was about 430 years. Now, Caleb says in Joshua 14:7 that he was 40 years old when Moses sent him to spy out the land with Joshua. And then in verse 10 of chapter 14, it tells us that Caleb is 85 at that time when he's given his land. So this brings us to a total of 485 years, give or take a year or two. And this is the time God waited to fulfill his promise to give Abram the land he arrived in all the way back in Shechem in Genesis. Now, in this passage of, Now, in this passage in chapter 23:16, we see another promise or prophecy that God would remove or make them perish from the land. Remember that God destroyed the nations of Canaan after waiting at least 430 years. In Genesis 15:16, God tells Abram that the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, we don't know how long before that statement was made that God was allowing them to build up their iniquity, but we can at least say it's at least 430 years. So how long did it take God to remove the Israelites? In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, we are told 480 years from the Exodus to the foundations of the temple King Solomon laid down in his 4th year as king. This year is believed to be 966 BC. The Assyrians took Israel around 722 BC, and the Babylonians took Judah around 605 BC. And now these are all from secular sources, so it's about 677 years for Israel, from the crossing into the Promised Land to transgressing out of the Promised Land, and then about 794 for Judah to do the same thing. All right, so what are some applications that we can gain from chapter 23? In this chapter, we talked about how the Israelites were not to cling to the other nations. Don't even associate with them or their gods. And if we go back to the garden, we have 2 trees. One is the tree of life, and the other is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Like we see in the garden, when we partake of sin, when we take a forbidden fruit, it can often open up knowledge of good and evil. And this is particularly true on the evil side of knowledge, where you learn of different realms of sin. Take some examples from our day, like sexual sins, or drinking excessively, doing drugs, for example. It's almost like you're initiated into this little crime organization. Here's all the ways that you can sin, and here's all the different ways you can get away with it. The Israelites, back to the Israelites, they were supposed to burn these idols and shun everything associated with these other nations. But once they were exposed to these gods and all the practices that were associated with the gods, we see their corruption. They are introduced to this new way to sin. We see later in Judges, they didn't purge the gods from the land and how they were influenced by it. So they took the forbidden fruit of these idols, and it taught them how to sin. Now, the pattern of the tree of knowledge of good and evil can be seen around us today in technologies like medicine, internet, weapons, chemical and biological research, artificial intelligence. Each of these examples create realms never thought of before. These open up many ethical decisions that we have to make that did not exist and require wisdom of how to use these technologies. We all know and have heard of good things that have come out of each of them. That would be the good part of the knowledge. Things like vaccination from viruses, curing diseases, germ theory, access to information across the globe, being able to easily defend your family from creatures or armed men that might break into your home, creating more food, helping poverty, analyzing trillions of data points in seconds to help solve many of the difficulties in life. But then comes sin. And due to our 3 natures of sin mentioned in 1 John 2:16, also John gave that lesson on Sunday night where he mentioned that. But that's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. We see the same technologies corrupted into euthanasia, pornography, murdering others with weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and the creation of fake images and videos using AI to mislead others. The world offers us a bunch of trees of knowledge of good and evil with fruit that can cause all sorts of problems. But God comes along and offers us a different kind of fruit, one that reveals to us the reality of our sinful nature and the knowledge of the path to salvation. Now, this fruit we are allowed to partake in, and it is the gospel that gives us life. A good study of Romans reveals to us the reality of the cross and the evil side of sin and how lost we really are, enemies even of God. But then Paul builds us up with the good news that Christ died for us and rose again that we might have a new life. The second application from chapter 23 has to do with not mixing with the other nations around us. Well, why was that? It was due to the fact that the other nations were worshiping other gods, like we just mentioned. In Jesus' prayer in John 17, paraphrasing a little bit, he points out that his followers are in the world, but not of the world. The Israelites are not to be of these other nations, even though they are neighbors to many of them. It would have been like if Noah had led in other people with him into the ark, other families. An interesting thing happened in Rome with the introduction to Christianity. Before Christ, the Roman Empire was very structured and had all these different groups of ethnic people who had their separate gods and religions, including the Jews. They all kind of looked the same. Then Christ came along and just blew that up. This is what can be called the Tower of Babel reversal, or the reversal of the dispersion of the Jews among the Gentiles. The people of the nations could unify once again and be under God. His disciples went everywhere. They went to Spain and Africa, India, Greece, Rome, and the message was anyone can become a Christian. And combined with the fact that it was becoming more and more prevalent, you can see why, if you're raised in a society that believes that you should be all parts of different groups, why it may have caused so much friction and major backlash against Christianity. And it bridged both ethnic and social and gender gaps. It just challenged everyone's, it just turned everything upside down for the empire. So the third application I think we can take from chapter 23 is that is regarding the phrase in verse 8 that we looked at, to cling to the Lord your God. And this might be hard for some of us to do. Our pride tells us that we can do it ourselves. I don't want to cling to anybody. That's our attitude. And sometimes this is put as being, clinging to God. Sometimes we're described as being under the shelter of God's wing, like a mother hen and her chicks. Many times God sees himself as the husband, and we are his wife, or his church, as his church. Other times God is father to us, and we are his children. All three of these, if pride is an issue with us, are hard for us to adopt. It's hard, I know, as a man, to think of yourself as a chick under a mother's wing, or as a wife. Like, I'm a man, I'm not a woman. Or like, I've already grown up, I'm not a child anymore. I don't want to be under the thumb of a father. And sometimes, as a man at least, I can relate to the struggle with this. But let's face it, we cling to many things in life, like our stocks, our retirement, our status in the community, our reputations, sports, our kids' sports, or our careers, maybe our land, our families, or our pets. Whatever our minds are more focused on is what we cling to. The Israelites were not immune to this at all. With clinging to the remnant of these nations and marrying them and following their gods. I mean, we can participate in many of these things that I mentioned in the context of clinging to God. We can still provide for our families, and we can still put our children in certain situations where they grow and they build character, and we teach them things like perseverance and teamwork, but it all has to be in the context of also clinging to God. And this reminds me of Paul from the New Testament. I always think of Paul as a wind-up toy because he just had zeal for the Lord from the get-go. And it was just like he was just pointed the wrong direction and he was just hitting the wall over and over, and God had to go and put him in the right direction. He's still going at the same speed, just had to be turned around. And God knows that the Israelites, as humans, have a tendency to cling to something. And so Joshua reminds them to, well, if you're going to cling to something, cling to God. He's there. Get close to him. And I think that's a good message for us today. So that's all I have for this week. I'm used to having the kids sing before and not having a couple extra pages, so we can blame it on them and not myself. But next week, we will look at Joshua chapter 24, and then I'll give my final thoughts on the book of Joshua. Thank you. You're dismissed.